Hey guys, we are about to greatly simplify a very tricky logic game that gave a lot of people a lot of trouble. So let's get started. This is LSAT Prep Test 88, game number 3, questions 13 through 17. We're going to start by mapping it out. Now, what's going on here? It says that Solomon, Tabitha, Ursula, Will, Zeppi are making arrangements of 4 flowers, selecting from these 4 types of flowers: gardenias, hyacinths, lilies, and roses. So it sounds like we're making arrangements of flowers with 4 flowers per arrangement. That sounds like a grouping game, right? It sounds like we're putting things into groups. It sounds like we're putting flowers into arrangements of flowers. So we're going to map this out like a grouping game, and we are going to make it look like every other grouping game that we've ever done. So as always, we start off by writing out the list of variables at the top of the page, in this case, G, H, L, and R. And then we put the group headers underneath, right? The headers of the 5 groups are the people: S, T for Tabitha, U for Ursula, W and Z. Notice how we are using lowercase letters because we always use lowercase letters for everything other than the main variables, just so that we don't get mixed up. And let's look at the parameters here. It says the arrangements, the groups, each have 4 flowers in them. So there's 4 in each. 4 things in each group, but it says 3 kinds of flowers. Each person uses 3 kinds. So even though there are 4 flowers in each group, there are 3 kinds of these 4 kinds that we have. Now, that means that you are going to have a double and 2 singles in each group, right? Because if you have to have 4 flowers but only 3 kinds of flowers, it means one of those 3 kinds has to be doubled in order to get the 4 flowers. So for example, you might have 2 G's, 1 H, and 1 R in a group, or 2 L's, 1 H, 1 G, or something like that, right? That's going to be what every group looks like. So let's take a look at the rules. This first rule tells us that Solomon and no one else uses 2 roses. Now, this is where a lot of people make a major mistake on this game. Now, whenever you have a rule about a particular group, what you always want to do is show that rule underneath that group that it applies to make it visually clear where the rule is relevant. So since we have a rule about Solomon, we want to show that rule under the Solomon group. But this rule says that Solomon and no one else uses 2 roses. So it's not just about Solomon, it's about all 5 groups. So the mistake that a ton of people make here is that they only write this under the Solomon group. They'll say something like 2R, only, or something like that, right? Which it's clear if you're looking at Solomon, it's clear that Solomon has to have 2 R's. But what about when you're looking at Ursula and you can't clearly see that this is also telling you that Ursula is not allowed to have 2 R's? So since this rule is telling you something about all 5 groups, and it's not the same thing for all 5, it's telling you something specific for Solomon, and then it's telling you something different for the other 4 groups, what you want to do to make this game as easy as possible is to write it underneath all 5 groups, since it applies to all 5 groups. So Solomon has 2 R's. This rule is telling you that Tabitha does not have 2 R's. This rule is telling you that Ursula does not have 2 R's, etc., right? It's telling you something about all 5 groups, and therefore you want to write it under all 5 groups. So that's rule number 1. The next rule is just about Tabitha. Tabitha uses exactly 1 H. So underneath Tabitha, we know there's going to be 1 H and at least 1 gardenia. So 1 or more, we know that means 1 or 2, right? Because there's always either a single or a double, right? There's no such thing as a triple because we know that the rules, the parameters tell us there have to be 4 flowers in each group and 3 kinds, which means there's going to be 3 types and one of them is going to be doubled and the other 2 are going to be single. If we tripled one of them, then we'd have 5 flowers, right? So anyway, 1 or 2 gardenias in the Tabitha group. Next, we are told that Ursula uses exactly 1 R and at least 1 hyacinth, so 1 or 2 hyacinths, 1 to 2 hyacinths. Will uses 2 gardenias. And then once again, we have a rule that tells us something about all 5 groups because it says Zeppi and no one else uses exactly 1 H and exactly 1 R. So 1 H, 1 R in Zeppi's group, right? And the other groups do not have 1 H and 1 R. They might have 1 H or 1 R, but they don't have both, right? So Will does not have this combination, right? Again, they might have 1 H and two R's or zero R's. They might have one R and zero H's or two H's, but they certainly cannot have this combination of one H and one R. So we have to write that underneath these other three groups. We don't need to write it under Solomon's group because Solomon already has two R's. So it would be extra information to say that Solomon can't have one H and one R, because of course Solomon's never going to have one H and one R because Solomon has two R's. So it's impossible for Solomon anyway to have one H and one R because Solomon can't have one R. So that would be how we write that rule. And then the final rule says that exactly one person uses two lilies. So we're going to write that off to the side. There's going to be one person with two lilies. That's one and no more. So we should be able to look at these rules and see that, wait a second, there's a lot of information underneath these groups. Perhaps we can find some inferences. For example, look at Tabitha. There's a ton of information under Tabitha's group, right? So let's see if we can make any inferences. I see the letter R over here and over here, right? So maybe we can put those two pieces of information together. Tabitha can't have two roses, and she also can't have one rose if she has one hyacinth, right? Because she can't have one hyacinth and one rose. But she also has to have one hyacinth. So since she has one hyacinth, she cannot have one rose, because that would break this. And she also can't have two roses, because that would break this. So therefore, Tabitha must, by process of elimination, if she's not having one rose or two roses, then the only other option is to have zero roses. And if she has zero roses, we know that her arrangement is made up of G, H, and L. Those are the only other three types of flowers, right? So we know that she's going to have one H because it says so. And the G and the L, one of them has to be a single and one of them has to be a double. But either way, it seems like it would work. And so therefore we have two options for what Tabitha's arrangement is going to be. Not too shabby, right? We've narrowed Tabitha down to just two arrangements. Let's see if we can do something similar for Ursula. Ursula has one rose and she has to have 1 to 2 hyacinths, but she cannot have one H and one R. So since she already has one R, that means she can't have one H, right? And if she can't have one H, she has to have two H's because she has to have either one or two H's. Which means we know that she's going to be one R because it says so, and two H's. And then the remaining thing has to be a single, right? Because you have to always have two singles and one double. And that single could be one of the two letters that are left, namely G or L. Once again, we've narrowed Ursula down to only two possibilities. What about Will? Let's see if we can do the same thing with Will. Will has two gardenias, and therefore the remaining two letters have to both be singles, but they can't be an H and an R, because once again, this Zeppi rule is really giving us a ton of information here for all these groups. It can't be an H and an R, right? And we only have three letters to choose from, H, R, and L, right? Because the G is already used with Will. So if you have to choose three singles from H, R, or L, and it can't be H and R, that means it has to either be L and H or L and R, right? Which means either way, there's going to be an L there. And the other one is going to be either H or R, and that is how we are going to follow the rules in the Will group. So once again, we've narrowed it down to two possibilities. What about Zeppi? Zeppi has one H and one R, and then of course the last thing has to be doubled, and there are two options, either L or G, and it seems like it could be either one. So once again, two possibilities. Pretty good, right? And if we look at our other rule over here off to the side, which tells us that one group has to have two lilies, exactly one group has to have two lilies, we see a couple of options, right? Zeppi could be the one that has two lilies. Let's mark that with a different color here. Zeppi could be the one that has two lilies. Will cannot have two lilies if we're just going to the left from there. Will clearly has one lily. Ursula has maybe one lily, but certainly not two lilies, as you can see. Tabitha might have two lilies, so Tabitha could also be the one that has two lilies, possibly. Solomon could never have two lilies because Solomon already has two roses, and you, of course, cannot double two letters because then you'd end up with more than 4 flowers in the group. So this setup might take a couple minutes to do all this, to see all these inferences and to write them on the page, but as long as you write those rules such that you put all the relevant information under all of the groups that the information is relevant to, then you should be able to see these inferences. These are all seeable inferences, and even if it takes you an extra minute or two to see all of this, we should now be able to fly through the questions because we can see everything very clearly on our setup. So therefore, let's go ahead and box this off as we would normally do at this point and go ahead to answer the questions. So for number 13, we are asked which of the following could be Ursula's group. Now we know that Ursula's group only has two options, right? As we have noted down here. Ursula's group is either 1R, 2H, 1G, or 1R, 2H, 1L. So we simply have to look for the answer that matches one of those two things. And if you are following along with me on LSAT Prep Test 88, question number 13, all you have to do is scan through the answers and you see that D matches one of these possibilities. D says 1G, 2H, 1R. 1G, 2H, 1R. So therefore D is the answer. The other four answer choices do not match either of these two possibilities, and thus they are impossible. That's it for number 13. Number 14 says which of the following could be a pair of people whose arrangements are identical. So we can easily narrow down a few things because we had a couple rules about a couple of the groups that were not allowed to be the same as the other groups. For example, Solomon was clearly the only one who could have two roses, which means no one else has two roses. So Solomon and anybody else could never be identical. So we can cross off any answer that has Solomon in it, like A and B. Same thing with Zeppi. Zeppi had something that had to be only Zeppi and no one else. Therefore, we can cross off any answer that has Zeppi in it, which means E, which means we're down to C and D for number 14 right off the bat within about 10 seconds. C and D. And now we just have to check our setup. So let's check for C. Could Tabitha and Will be the same? Well, let's see. If we're looking at Tabitha and Will, Will has to have two G's, and Tabitha could have two G's, right? Will has to have one L, and Tabitha could have one L, especially if she has two G's, then she has to have one L. And then Tabitha would have to have that one H, and Will could have the one H as well. That's an option for Will, and therefore they could be the same group, and we are done. We just have to look at the setup. We don't actually have to draw it out like I just did. You can just look over here and see that they match, right? You see the 2G under both of them, you see the 1L option under both of them, and you see the 1H, at least as an option under both of them. And therefore, those two can be the same, so C is the answer, and we're done with number 14, right? D would be impossible. Ursula and Will, if we look at Ursula and Will, Ursula has to have two H's, but Will has to have two G's. So they're definitely doubling a different letter, and therefore they cannot be the same. So that's it for number 14. Again, if you set this game up properly, these questions mostly should just be taking about 20 seconds each. So let's look at 15. 15 says, if lilies are used by exactly two people, and if of those two only one uses any H, then who could those two people be? Well, first of all, let's start with the first half of the if. If lilies are used by two people, who are those two people going to be? Do we have any people that must use lilies? And the answer is yes, right? We see some people that could use lilies. For example, Zeppi could have two lilies, or she could have two G's, which would mean no lilies, right? But Will has to have one lily. Will must be one of those two people using lilies, right? Ursula could have a lily or not, right? She could also have a G instead of the lily. But Tabitha has to have either one or two lilies. So Tabitha's definitely going to have at least one lily, maybe two. And therefore, if there are two people using lilies, and those are the only two people using lilies, they must always be T and W. There are no other options, right? Because Tabitha and Will, according to our setup, always have at least one lily. Will always has exactly one. Tabitha always has either one or two. And therefore, we don't even need to read the end of this question. As soon as it says if lilies are used by exactly two of the people, we know who those two people are, Tabitha and Will, and therefore C is correct, and all the other ones are wrong because they don't say Tabitha and Will. So once again, all we have to do is look at our setup to answer this question very quickly. Let's look at number 16, which of the following must be true. We have a whole heck of a lot of stuff that must be true in the way of all these inferences down here. So we should be able to find something that matches with what we have. Does Tabitha have to have no lilies? No, I'm looking at Tabitha, and Tabitha, in fact, has to have at least one lily. So it's exactly the opposite of A, right? A is impossible. What about B? Does Tabitha have to have no roses? Yes, that was our very first thing that we saw, is that Tabitha's arrangement has to be made up of H, G, and L, and no roses, because Tabitha is not allowed to have 2 roses, and Tabitha's also not allowed to have 1 rose, because then she'd have 1 H and 1 R, which would break another rule. So therefore, the first thing we saw was that Tabitha must have no roses, which of course is the answer here. It's exactly what B says, and therefore B is the answer, and we are done. The other 3 don't have to be true, right? C, Solomon's arrangement containing lilies or no lilies, either way is an option, because as you can see with Solomon, he's got plenty of options. He has the least amount of restriction. Will containing no hyacinths. No, Will is allowed to have a hyacinth. As you can see, it's an option for him to have either a hyacinth or a rose. And of course, Will containing no rose is exactly the same thing. Exactly that same part of Will's inferences tells us that Will has to have either an H or an R. So D and E are both things that don't have to be true. Either he could have an H or an R. And therefore, none of these are the answer. Of course, we already knew that B was the answer anyway. So let's look at 17. This was really the first question that we actually had to do something for, because everything else stemmed straight from our inferences that we found straight from the beginning. 17, however, changes the rules on us, and they flip one of the conditions that were given. It says, suppose the condition that only Zeppi uses exactly 1 H and exactly 1 R. Let's say we replace that with another rule that Zeppi and at least one other person uses exactly 1 H and exactly 1 R. So it used to be that we knew that T, U, and W are not allowed to use 1 H and 1 R because of that rule said that Zeppi was the only one who could use 1 H and 1 R. And now they're saying just the opposite. Not only are they allowed to, but one of them has to. It says Zeppi and at least one other person must use exactly 1 H and 1 R. So, as you can see, unfortunately, we are going to lose all of those inferences that we made at the beginning. Right? All of these things down here all came from, at least partly, from this rule, from this thing that we knew. And therefore, we have to get rid of all of it. Right? Zeppi doesn't change at all, right? Because Zeppi still has to have 1 H and 1 R. So everything we knew about Zeppi is still true. But now, these 3 groups in the middle, not only do we have a restriction that they're not allowed to have 1 H and 1 R, not only are they now allowed to have 1 H and 1 R, but at least one of them has to have exactly 1 H and 1 R. That's what this rule substitution is telling us. Now notice how this still only applies to the 3 groups in the middle, T, U, and W. Either way, it's irrelevant to Solomon, because Solomon already has 2 roses, right? So there's no way that Solomon could ever have 1 H and 1 R, because Solomon, by definition, has 2 R's. And therefore, we still don't have to write anything for Solomon. But this rule is telling us that one of those 3 groups in the middle, maybe more, maybe 2 or all 3 of them, possibly, have to have 1 H and 1 R. So now it's a totally different game than we started with. And now using these new rules, we are going to have to answer question number 17. So let's take a look at the question. It says, which of the following must be true? And the way that we test out must be true questions is, of course, as you know, to try to make each answer choice false, right? And so we're going to go ahead and start off with A. So we're going to set up the groups. And of course, we actually have to draw everything out here, but that's okay because it's the first question here that we actually have to do. So far, the rest of the game was very quick. So let's look at A. A says Tabitha has exactly 1 rose. So looking at Tabitha, we know that Tabitha can't have 2 roses, right? That's still a rule over here. And we're trying to make A false. We're trying to see whether A has to be true, right? So we're not going to try to make A true. That wouldn't make any sense, right? Remember, must be true questions. We test them out by trying to see if we can make them false. So we're going to try to make Tabitha not have exactly 1 rose. The only other option, therefore, would be to have 0 roses, because Tabitha has a rule that says she cannot have 2 roses. So therefore, Tabitha is going to have 0 roses as we test out A, which means if we're looking at Tabitha, Tabitha always has 1 H, and then the other 2 letters are going to have to be G and L. So let's go ahead and take care of our 2 Lily rules. So, so looking at Tabitha, Tabitha always has to have 1 H, according to our rules. And she's going to have no roses in A, so therefore she is going to have G and L. Let's go ahead and take care of our 2 lily rule. Someone has to have 2 lilies. We might as well get that out of the way just to make our life easier. And therefore, it's going to be 1 H, 1 G, and 2 L's. Now let's go down the line. Let's go to Ursula. Ursula has 1 R and either 1 or 2 H's. Let's make it 1 H because we want to get ahead of this rule, right? We want to take care of this. One of these 3 in the middle has to have 1 H and 1 R, so we might as well get that out of the way. So therefore, it's going to be 1 R, 1 H, and 2, let's say 2 G's, because if it were 2 L's, that would break the rule of the 2 lilies, right? Only one person is allowed to have 2 lilies. So that'll be Ursula. Will be 2 G, and it doesn't really matter. We can put 1 H and 1 R again in Will, right? It's at least one of them, but even more than one is also fine. So we might as well just do that, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't. And then Zeppy, of course, also has 1 H and 1 R, and not 2 lilies because we already got that out of the way. So therefore, it's going to be 2 G's. And then just to round this off, Solomon is going to always have 2 roses and then 2 singles of something. And it doesn't really seem to matter. Let's say 1 G and, I don't know, 1 H. And therefore, we have a full scenario here. I know that took a little bit longer than the average scenario takes to draw out on a logic game just because this is such a complicated setup. Just because this is such a large kind of a setup. Just because this is somewhat of a large setup. But that being said, we've tested out A, we made A false, and we showed that we were able to follow all the rules. Therefore, A is not the answer. And since we have so much on the page, we should be able to hopefully just make small changes to this to go ahead and do the other answer choices. For example, B. B says exactly 1 arrangement contains no roses. Well, on the page with A, we actually did make B true, because as you can see, there's roses there, and there, and there is exactly 1 arrangement that didn't have roses. However, we can make a very quick change to make that false, right? All we have to do is change something into a rose, right? We can go ahead. However, we can make a quick change to make that false. All we have to do is change one of these roses. So for example, looking at Will didn't have to have a rose. This rose could have been 1 lily, and that wouldn't have changed anything. And therefore, that would have made B false, right? Because then there would have been 2 arrangements that have no roses, and therefore B could have been false, and therefore B's not the answer either. C says exactly 2 arrangements have 1 R and 1 H. That definitely we showed doesn't have to be true, because Zeppy has 1 R and 1 H, right? Ursula has 1 R and 1 H, and Will could have had 1 R and 1 H. That was an option when we did A. And therefore, we showed that it was possible for 3 arrangements to have 1 R and 1 H, and therefore C doesn't have to be true either. So that leaves us with D and E. D says at least 1 arrangement has no H. Well, look at that. The way we have this drawn out on the page, every single arrangement has an H. And therefore, if D were the answer, that would be impossible. D says it has to be true that at least 1 arrangement has no H. We made that false. 0 arrangements contain no H. And therefore, by process of elimination, E is the answer, and we are done the game. Now, even though we are 100% done, and we don't have to test out E because we've definitively proven that A, B, C, and D can all be false, let's say for whatever reason you started with E on this question and you wanted to see what it looked like to test E, and you just wanted to see why E has to be true, right? Or let's say you had some extra time at the end of the section and you just wanted to check your work and you wanted to see why does E have to be true. So were we to try to make E false, E says at least 1 arrangement has no lilies. So if we were to make that false, then that would mean that 0 arrangements contain no lilies. In other words, that all 5 of them have lilies, right? They all have to have lilies in order to make E false. That's the only way to make the statement in E false, right? And we know that one of them is going to have 2 lilies. Now, looking at our setup with Zeppy, Zeppy either has 2 lilies or 2 G's, right? And therefore, if Zeppy has lilies, there's no option to have 1 lily, right? So Zeppy would therefore have to be the one that has 2 lilies. And that means that everyone else has to have 1 lily, right? Because of our rule that says 1 person and no more than 1 person has 2 lilies. Now, this maybe would have worked were it not for this new rule in this question, which told us that one of these middle three groups has to have one H and one R. Why is that going to be a problem? Because whichever one of these groups we apply that rule to, let's say it's the middle one, well, guess what? We'll end up with three singles. That's not allowed. That's not within the parameters of this game. As we know from the very beginning, each group is going to have 4 flowers and 3 kinds, which means there's going to have to be a double and 2 singles in each group. You're never allowed to have 3 singles. That would break that rule. And therefore, this would not work, and we would have to do this in one of these middle 3 groups, whether it's Ursula or Tabitha or Will. It says at least one of these would have to have one H and one R, and we're not able to do that if all of them have lilies. And therefore, E false would not be an option. And since we can't make E false, E must be true, and that's why it is the correct answer. But I think it's much faster to do this question by process of elimination. It happens to be that E is the last answer choice. So if you go ahead and test A out, you'll see that you can just make very small changes to A, generally speaking, to test out B, C, and D, and you should then be in the clear. So hopefully you now see that this game could have been much easier with a intuitive and clear setup. You can see a lot of inferences that will help you really fly through the vast majority of these questions. And then 17 requires a little bit of work, but even 17 wasn't so bad. So I'm hoping that now this game seems much easier to you than it did at the beginning of this video. If you like this video, be sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And for our full database of LSAT tutorial videos, head on over to masterlsat.com. This is Nate Morris, and I'll see you in the next video.